to give your presentation. Oh, thanks. And yeah, following that, we'll go into breakout groups for some discussion. But John and Aimee, over to you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Hannah. Really appreciate the introduction. And again, we're really thrilled to be here. It's great to get the opportunity to talk data with you all. And like, again, this is not just sort of us here to tell you a bunch of things and that's it. We're also really interested in hearing the discussion that comes from this conversation. So let's get started. So Hannah already did a really great job of sort of running through the boilerplate what Open North is. We have some more in here. I'm not going to read through all these slides. These are more for when we share them after the presentation. But what I will say is that we, particularly Aimee and I, most closely work with cities across Canada on a variety of topics around sort of digital transformation and data. A big focus is obviously around climate, particularly going forward around climate resiliency, and understanding the many ways that in which data interacts with climate initiatives and climate action. I think a really key point, I don't imagine I really need to stress it too much within this group, but data is but a tool. We don't suggest that that alone is going to solve the climate crisis. But similar to like technology and a lot of these things, like it is a tool that we can use and we use it better once we understand it more clearly. I really appreciated Hannah's earlier walkthrough of the kind of work that you all are doing. For example, around buildings and fossil fuels, I think is a really great example that we'll get into a little later about the various ways we don't think about the data that cities have and how it impacts what we're trying to do around climate. All right, so to get started, we're going to jump over to a Mentimeter fairly shortly. And just before I do that, just wanted to sort of like outline how we're approaching talking about data today in this session. And this isn't the only way to talk about it, but just we felt it was helpful for the context of this conversation. So we've broken it up into climate mitigation data. So this is the data that we use to measure our climate impact, the actions that we're taking to reduce it. This is obviously important when we want to examine the proposed goals laid out in the climate action plans, like Hannah mentioned, and the contrast to the progress that's actually happening. We also have climate adaptation data. So this is how climate change is changing the world around us. The examples that often come most quickly to mind are of the growing risks that us as humans face. So just like, again, contextualizing sort of like what we're talking about when we're talking about this data, knowing that that's not the only way to think of climate adaptation. And then when talking about climate justice data, understanding the impact of climate change requires that understanding of people and systems. So again, this is that part about like, what data do we know about the buildings that municipalities have? And understanding like who is impacted. So are the risks and the benefits that come from climate change and the climate action equal? I think we're all well aware they're not. But this is again why these kind of points are really key. So again, these are broad, they overlap quite a bit, and none of them are mutually exclusive in any way. So often data that we might be considering climate adaptation will also be used as climate mitigation. All right, so the point here I want to make with this slide is that data tells a story. Understanding that story and why it's being told to us is important if we want to use that data. It helps us understand its limitations so we can more effectively use it. We have a quote here, data and data sets are not objective. They are creations of human design. So again, this is the same sort of sentiment I think a lot of folks have been seeing around like conversations around AI and automation. These aren't naturally neutral. We can't think of them that way. I don't know if folks here have read Cathy O'Neill's book, Weapons of Math Destruction. It really lays that point out really clearly about when we think of these things as neutral, we give them a lot more power than they should, and it really limits our ability to use them. So I'm going to dive into some of the questions we need to ask when looking at or trying to access climate data from municipal governments. So this is mostly around origin and purpose. But we'll also touch way too briefly on the mess that is data standardization, as I'm sure a few of you are probably already familiar with some of the struggles in that space. Cool. So when we talk about origin, I've sort of broken up to 3 pieces here. So the first one I want to highlight is sort of asking this question around like who collected this data in the first place? Was it collected by the city? Did the city buy it or pay a third party to collect it? Is it publicly available data that the city compiled? Or did it come from a data sharing agreement with other municipalities, organizations, or communities? These questions are really important because obviously different organizations have different driving factors that they're going to consider when collecting and sharing data. So, sorry, I just have to move things around here to be able to see my other screen. So an example here is if a municipality has GHG emissions data, they're sharing, did they collect this themselves or did they pay a consultant, which is often the case, to collect that data? So I'm sure if you've read through climate action plans, you'll often see there's a reference to a baseline GHG emission study, but understanding if the city didn't collect this data themselves, this obviously impacts their ability to measure against that going forward. So these are the kind of questions we want to ask around who collects the data. In terms of how the data was collected, there are finite resources available for data collection just in general, but this is especially so for municipal governments. This isn't to give them a pass, but this is to understand sort of some of the limitations that we're going to run up against. Because this impacts data collection processes and helps us understand the gaps and assess their impact on the quality of the data for our purpose. So again, I'm going to lean heavily on the examples here to really make these points, but if a city is building bike infrastructure based on bicycle accidents, so putting bicycle infrastructure where bike accidents most often happen, what are some of the what are some of the challenges they would encounter in collection? I'll leave that a little bit open. Feel free to throw stuff in the chat. Can come up later. But just something to think about in terms of some of the restrictions that exist around data collection. And so the last point here is around depth. So is this meant to be a representative sample, or does it include data from all possible sources? Does it accurately represent residents and their needs? Minority groups can often have their needs minimized in larger data sets that focus on solving problems for the most people with the fewest amount of resources. So think about some cities maybe that have dense urban cores, but spread out and have also a rural population. A lot of resources may be focused on the dense urban cores because that's essentially the best like ROI, so return on investment the city might get. So the example here that we chose was around air quality. This is, again, a familiar one for a lot of folks, I'm sure, but air quality can vary significantly across the city, right? It's not, you don't take a sample in one spot in the city and like that's the same across the city. But cities often, when they are able to measure air quality, rely on a single station or a single few stations strategically positioned around the city. This obviously limits the ability to collect like more localized data around air quality, and is particularly something we want to watch out for when you want to really focus on where's air quality the worst. Often, again, this goes to the climate justice aspect. Something we'll often see is it's the folks where the neighborhoods where income levels are lowest suffer from the worst air quality. Again, not always the case, but to understand that we need to have more localized data around air quality. Okay. So the other one is around purpose. So the first thing we asked before how the data was collected, but it's also asking why the data was collected. Data should be collected with a clear and communicated purpose. We shouldn't just be collecting data just because we can. And so this obviously applies for cities as well. So understanding that purpose allows us to better contextualize the data in front of us. And purpose is not just important for data that is collected, but for data that is not. So understanding why some data isn't collected can better position external stakeholders to encourage governments to collect data that we believe is valuable. Move things again. So I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the Federation of Canadian Municipalities Partner for Climate Protection. For climate protection. A lot of those will be collecting data on GHG emissions as part of the program. So that's, for a lot of those folks, a big motivating factor. So if your municipality isn't collecting GHG emissions, it might be easier if you can sort of suggest participation in programs like that, as opposed to starting collecting that emission data just on their own. Again, this isn't always the case, but understanding the different ways to motivate cities to collect the data that you want can be really helpful in this work. Dun, dun, dun. Okay, and so why is the data available or not? So sometimes it's a political calculation. A city may not want to share something that makes them look bad or suggest an alternative approach to the way they are doing things. This is especially so around climate data, obviously. However, there's many other factors that might also influence data availability. There's going to be issues of capability and capacity to make the data open and available. Not every city is going to be able to put all of the data they have up on an open portal, just simply by limitation of staff time, understanding how to do that, and money in general. There's also going to be issues around data privacy and or rights. And there's also issues around the quality or accessibility of the data. Putting data up there that isn't of a high enough quality or isn't ultimately going to be accessible even when it's up there to the majority of residents. These kind of calculations have to be made. So an example here is, and this is in the political, is data on air quality along busy roads. Same question, why would this data be shared and why would it not be? And obviously, depending on the government that we're talking about, they might be really happy to share that data because it aligns with sort of the direction they want to go. Alternatively, if it doesn't, maybe a greater issue. Right. Sorry, I have to keep moving things around here on my screen. Cool. And so really quickly, again, and I apologize because this is such a big one and like this is its own multi-series piece really, is this thing around data standardization. So one of the issues that I'm sure a lot of you have encountered, why is this? Sorry, I'm just trying to move some things here. There we go. Yeah, is just there's really no standard. You might find a standard across a few municipalities or a few different places that use the same standard. But ultimately, there's just a constantly growing proliferation of standards that are available. So this XKCD comic illustrates this point really, and that was bound to happen. Illustrates this point really, really well, right? Is that everyone will be like, there's too many standards. We're going to create our own new one that will work for everybody, but that's just not how it works. You have one more standard. And it just starts to create this like growing entanglement and chaos. However, there's a reason why that's a constant goal that we are always trying to move towards, right? And so this is what allows us to better compare across municipalities, whether that's in Canada or abroad. It allows for this interoperability, the ability for governments, organizations, and the public to share and learn from a wide array of data sets. Yeah, and again, this is a really brief overview. There's a lot of really great resources out there that talk and dive into this more, but again, it's a complicated challenge. All right, I'm gonna hand it over to Aimee.
Kia ora, everybody. Thank you very much, John. Everybody, John is currently driving our slides, so I'll just let him know when to skip forward or backwards or cause general chaos. So yes, coming to you from Otatai, Christchurch, New Zealand. I'm very glad to be here. So thank you very much for having us. This is such an important topic. So I'm going to take us through a couple of points around community-driven data collection and a little bit, I'll touch on climate justice as well. So if we're thinking, when we're talking about community-driven data collection, what we mean is it's about collecting and also sharing and using and analyzing and so forth. Absolutely. Data that based on the needs of the community, right? Not collecting and doing whatever with that data based on the needs of a private sector company or even potentially government. It's all about the community and what generates value for that community. So as a result, we believe certainly that this means that this form of data collection should ideally if community is important here, and depending on how you define community and the context, have a social and climate and environmental justice lens applied to it, and that comes with it. There is a lot of talk about how this sort of thing is, as a result, especially relevant when confronting climate change, because that is this huge obstacle that is sort of the cause and effect of a whole bunch of localized cultural and political and environmental realities that communities are facing. It doesn't have to be collected by the community, though. It could well be collected by other people, and a lot of the time probably will be. In science, we call it citizen science. You know, is the data can come from various places, but at large, the public is involved in helping to conduct the science in whatever way that looks, and it's tremendously powerful. It's done some incredible things over the years. So I thought, as ways to, rather than just giving you some definitions, I thought I'd illustrate it with a couple of examples. So Kings County and City of Seattle had a deadly extreme heat incident a couple of years back that killed a swath of people. And as a result of that, they undertook what they're calling a groundbreaking heat mapping project that quantified the harmful inequitable impact because of course you can imagine the impact was inequitable that these extreme heat events in summers are having. So what they did was they had volunteers in the community help the King County and City of Seattle, you know, officials record more than, the number here is 110,000 temperature measurements at 3 different times of the day during a one-day extreme heat event. And because they collected them at 1-second intervals while they were driving designated routes through the city, which is quite cool because it means that you can make sure that you aren't just driving through the leafy suburbs, right? Or that your air sensors aren't only next to a highway, or only definitely not next to a highway because people don't want to think about it. And so forth. So and that had a whole bunch of impact. So they formed a group of people around sort of the climate action planning. This was fed into their climate action planning and other short and long-term actions, including emergency management, public health, homelessness, you know, human services, land use, all of that sort of thing. As you can imagine, what it showed with the inequity was that places with more concrete, for example, more built stuff and fewer trees and whatnot, tended to record much higher temperatures. So there you've got to be thinking about your land use and so forth. And those areas are, as a general rule, likely to be much more vulnerable areas. So it was really cool. And you're welcome to, you can go and read about it. They actually show what the maps look like. They're really nicely detailed maps. And they have been published as well. So it's all very cool. Another example, and I have no idea how to pronounce this. I can pronounce Te Māori, Te Māori and other languages, but this one is not me. I should have looked it up. But Ikagwik Sikukun, so Ice Age, and this was a number of researchers coming together with community leaders and Indigenous people to try and understand better the extent of huge changes to sea ice in this area in Alaska. Because, well, I mean, I'm sure you know that the north is heating 4 times faster on average than the rest of the world, whereas Canada is only 2 times fast. So yeah, it was another one of those things of, you know, this idea of incorporating not only community knowledge, but Indigenous long-term on-the-ground knowledge into sort of more Western scientific views. And again, went very, very well. So it was difficult because science doesn't always like to do that. working with the community is often seen as outreach, not actual like work. There are definitely challenges. Funding, of course, finds multidisciplinary situations very tricky. But long-term things very tricky. But these are challenges, not, you know, obstacles. Well, not barriers, not permanent barriers. Things are changing. Things can get better, and there is increasing will, right, amongst funders and science and so forth, to understand these are complex things. So yes, the Ice Edge situation. There is also a documentary you can go and watch on YouTube about it if you want to, which sounds like an awesome thing to do. So that's just a couple of examples, but there are heaps of them, and more. You'll often find around nature-based solutions, food solutions, there will be community involvement as well, but in various lots of ways. So a note here is that scaling these sorts of impacts is often going to be difficult because the effects are by their very nature local and indeed hyperlocal, and so the actions that you need to take are probably going to be hyperlocal if they're to be most effective a lot of the time, or coordinated across a region, depending on what the impact is and who it's affecting, right? But that doesn't mean that all is lost, and you know, we just have to try and all deal with it on our own, and it's very difficult and it's ineffective. What the scaling can come from the knowledge that's gained on what can work in various situations, what people have done, you know, like cool case studies are like, they made a climate walk around their local lake, they did this, they did that, they did that. So that sort of thing can work very well. So and so can lessons and things like that. There is a group called the Earth Network out of Columbia University Science and Society Center for Science and Society. And they, for example, are working on basically a best practices in co-producing with your local community guide. So I'm keeping a very close eye on that, because that's around the ethics of co-production, making sure that when you do it, you aren't recolonizing all over again, for example, or using people's work without giving them due credit and so forth. So there's lots of thinking happening in the area. Ontario and Fraser Basin Council have also put out some really cool resources for people working in adaptation and are happy to work with people directly. So that's, I think, where you can start to see scale, and funding, of course. Funding can come at scale as well if one can figure out how to share it. So that's some brief thoughts there. We'll move on to the consideration slide. Thank you. So some things that I always have in the back of my head up there with collection is that, you know, just because you can doesn't mean you should, which I think is a general life rule. So the data that you're looking for and that will help you address your needs is to a large extent going to be defined by your geography, like the land and the water around you, and what your community needs. And those will often be very heavily intertwined, depending on the lands and sort of whether urban or rural. But that will define a lot of what you're looking for here. Also be aware, and we see this a lot, is people tend to forget that technology, and data is included as technology, should be there to serve the community, not the other way around. So be very wary of people who come in with a technological solution that will save everything. That's probably not going to be the case. And what tends to happen is then people get slotted into serving the tool, the technology, and potentially the company who owns it, rather than the other way around. So think about that when you're dealing with people, when you're signing contracts with people, potentially for technological services or products, all of that sort of thing. I won't rant too much about it, but you can always contact us afterwards if you have questions. In terms of where to find data, this is often a really big question for people. So the first place that I would be doing is checking the open data portals, or whatever people call them, of your local and then your provincial and then your federal government, because there often is quite a lot of data in open data portals. There'll also be reports and things like that on websites, which generally aren't classed as open data, but there will be really good stuff in there. So it's just a bunch of research. see if you can get in touch with somebody in those organizations who knows the organization well. They may be able to help navigate you to what's going on and who to speak with. If you have to, you may have to use your freedom of access to information type requests, when you say, boy, give it to us. But I know that can take a long time, and there are loopholes. The other thing that I found working in open data over the years is, and as John was saying earlier, is sometimes it's not that people don't want to open to publish data, it's that they're not sure what to choose because they have limited resources. So if you're asking them for stuff and you're explaining to them why you need it and how you'll do it and how it's incredibly valuable, that is a brilliant, brilliant incentive for them to open it up for everybody. So consider making friends with people and being like, I know it's really difficult sometimes, but I was always chuffed when somebody asked me nicely to open up data rather than yelling at me about the fact that the data wasn't open. And then we would work on it. Another thing, and y'all will know this, is that if you're co-producing this sort of knowledge with people and these sorts of insights, the community does need to be involved the entire way through, right? It's not just sort of as a tick box exercise at certain milestones. Is like we spoke to them at the beginning and then we spoke to them at the end. You are co-producing in the truest sense of the word. It can make things slower sometimes, not necessarily, but it'll produce much better effects. And impacts and quality, and you've got buy-in and everybody's happy, and then they help with the work. It's very cool. You get virtuous circles. And a final one is if you are asking for money, and let's be honest, we all have to, right? That's the name of this. And there's nothing wrong with that. But when you are doing it, push funders for time as well as money. So I mentioned that earlier is with a lot of these sorts of projects, you're funded to do a very narrow thing, which automatically will make it difficult to make it multidisciplinary or have community actually involved or anything like that. So that's already a stricture, but they'll tend to give it like a year or 2 years or whatever. Push them for longer time. However that looks big, and explain that part of the reason for that is a lot of this work, in order to make it most valuable and most effective, is about building very strong relationships. And relationships, you don't build those overnight. You don't build that kind of trust overnight, especially with, well, it depends on the culture. But some cultures will take longer to really build those incredibly strong bonds within others, but then those bonds are also incredibly strong, right? They're not just sometimes, yeah. So some cultures are a little more transactional than others. So push for time is what I'm saying, and really, really focus on building strong relationships through the networks. That is gold for all of the good reasons. So that's probably enough of me ranting on there. And then climate justice, I'm going to touch on this very quickly because I'm fairly sure that everybody in the room knows about climate justice, probably knows a lot more than I do about it. So I'm going to give it more of a nod to say, we're aware. So climate justice is this idea that, thank you, Jay. I'm just having a look at your comment now quickly, and then I'll get back to the talk. Yep. Cool. FCM, very cool. That's really interesting. So the cost of living has gone through the roof because of climate action? That's very interesting. This will be interesting to speak to in the breakout rooms. I think we can dive more into that because that's very interesting. But climate justice, talk about timing. So yes, climate justice is this idea that we have a right to a livable planet. I would argue all life does, not just humans. And we're not necessarily doing so well at that at the moment. So it's sort of it intersects very strongly with social justice, of course. It intersects strongly with environmental justice while not being the same thing, although people do often conflate them and they've got a lot in common. They do have slightly different sort of core foci. There's the concept of a just transition. I'm sure you're all very familiar with that as well. It's like how, as we transition into a better economies, better carbon economies, how can we do that in ways which don't make things even worse for people, our most vulnerable people? So how do we bring everyone along? Yeah, we'll know all about this. And then data rights. and data justice, data sovereignty. So that's something that more and more people are starting to see. And this is why we're here today, right? Starting to see that sort of the climate piece is incredibly important and really huge. And the data and technology and digitization piece is kind of big. And people say, well, one can help with the other, but is also, in all fairness, making the other worse. So there's some stuff to balance out here. But what could happen is if we actually try to start doing the thinking around in integrating all of these various fields, so that we have something that really is coordinated, is collaborative, is effective, rather than siloed billions of plans that sort of run over each other. See Hannah nodding essentially. So a classic example of this is against extreme heat, and I know it's one of the big ones for Canada, and increasingly so. So it's a perfect example of climate justice is this idea that it will tend to affect vulnerable people more. A lot of those people live in areas in which poverty is probably a factor. And then with all of that come health conditions potentially that have arisen because of that or are worsened because of that. And then the extreme heat comes along and then it knocks a whole bunch of people over. It's a terrible tragedy. It's a beautiful example of where climate justice comes in. And the CBC did do this No Escape from the Heat sort of series of investigations across a number of centres in Canada. I do recommend reading it. It's very well done if you're not already aware of it. Cool. And so that's sort of the basics on that. I could go on forever and ever and ever and ever and ever, but I'm not going to. So that's me. I'm going to pass back on to John and Hannah.
Cool. Yeah, I did realize, Hannah, that I just blew past the Mentimeter section. I apologize to everyone for that. You're not missing much, but it was there. If we have time at the end, happy to do it, but I don't want to take any more time away from the discussions. So Hannah, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you. That was, thank you so much for the presentation. That was really amazing. And I think the Mentimeter question was just around what kinds of data are people interested in, if I remember correctly, right? So I think that that's something that we can very much incorporate into the breakout group discussions, which we will go to now. So we'll spend about, I think about 20 minutes in these, and then we'll have a chance at the end to kind of report back and share a little bit about these discussions. We'll be talking a little bit about our thoughts on the presentation, as well as, our relationship to data. How do we think we could use it in our lives? What is maybe missing from our municipal data? And I liked in your presentation, John and Aimee, like drawing attention to that, like sometimes, especially the point around like sometimes it is maybe you don't want to publicly showcase data that shows how you're failing to meet your climate targets, and sometimes it is just a number of different factors, including that nobody has asked this data to be made public. I thought that was a great helpful tip, Aimee. So yes, thank you so much. And without further ado, I'm going to open the breakout rooms. You should see an invite to join one now.